It's October 11th, 2024. We're right in the middle of the aftermath of two devastating hurricanes, Helene and Milton, which hit the coast of Florida, basically back to back. So I decided to push back our podcast production schedule because I was able to get an interview with Dr. Balfour Spence, an expert from the University of Brandon who specializes in disaster recovery and food security. I'm going to apologize ahead of time if you're watching this on YouTube because we had some difficulty with the studio and instead had to revert to basically recording on Zoom. And of course, Zach, my video editor, is out of town visiting family, so the editing was done by yours truly. But as one of my mentors has said, done is better than perfect. And this is an amazing discussion on the two disasters and how we can actually prevent these things from happening. Enjoy the episode. I'm Garrett Wong, and this is the Investing to Win podcast. How do you define success, and what does winning look like for you? Dr. Spence, thank you for coming and welcome to my podcast.
Thank you very much, Garrett. It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, no, I like to make sure that my guests are prepared. Now, let me ask you, do you prefer Balfour or Dr. Spence? How do you want me to address you for this afternoon?
You know, Balfour is great.
Okay. All right. Balfour it is. So Balfour, I like to have my guests on my podcast introduce themselves. So why don't you start with a very light background? I'm going to dig into your background because that's kind of the topic of discussion today in your experience. But why don't you just give us a little bit tidbits about yourself?
Okay. Well, currently, I am a professor in applied disaster and emergency studies at Brandon University. I've been at this here for 16 years now, and I've previously spent 16 years as a professor in geography and geology at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, where I am from. I have worked extensively in disaster risk management and food security issue throughout the Circum-Caribbean region, that is northern part of South America, Central America, the Caribbean region, as well as short stints in Southeast Asia.
Wow.
Yes. So in a nutshell, that's who I am.
Okay. What brought you into the field of this study?
Well, I did my undergraduate studies in geography and geology at the University of the West Indies at the Mona campus in Jamaica. And I recall my first summer, end of my first year, my geomorphology professor asked me, "What are you doing for the summer?" And I said, "Nothing." And she said, "Go over to Mines and Geology and tell them I sent you because we're setting up a national disaster office for Jamaica and there might be something there for you." Well, I was thrown in the deep end because immediately after I joined there, we had a major hurricane on our hand. So I had a wonderful laboratory, and that I think that was what got me going in this direction. I saw the opportunity to change the way we deal with hazards and disasters. And you notice I'm making that distinction between hazards and disasters.
Okay.
And to ensure that what we do in terms of managing these events contribute to our quest for sustainability and development.
Okay. So let me back up for a second there. Brandon University out here in Manitoba, did you say there's an actual department for disaster recovery?
Absolutely. Actually, there is a department in the Faculty of Science for applied disaster and emergency studies. And importantly, it is one of only 2 such programs in Canada.
In Canada, wow.
Yeah.
So
dedicated programs. Yeah.
That's amazing. I mean, how well covered is this in the educational forums around the world?
Well, if we one way of measuring that is by where we pull our students from. And we pull students from across Canada as well as internationally. We also pull our faculty from, yeah, I'm from Jamaica,
Of course.
faculty member from Japan, etc.
Okay, just curious, where is the second place in Canada, the educational facility, institution where this is taught?
York University.
York. Okay, I do a lot of work with York and their students. Excellent, excellent facility. Wow, who would have thought? Okay, well, that's super interesting. I'm already thinking with all the disasters, and there's only 2 institutions in all of Canada. I hope my listeners are prodding their young educational minds, because I think you have a shortage.
I'll hasten to say, though, that there are other institutions that do other aspect of managing hazards and disaster. But in terms of a dedicated university program, especially at the undergraduate level, there are just 2. Royal Roads has a master's program of a kind, but without the foundational background in the undergraduate program or having the practical experience, it would be a little daunting.
No, for sure. So back up a second again. You mentioned there's a distinct difference between hazards and disasters. Can you define that for our audience?
Okay. Now, a hazard is that event where energy is released either from or the internal parts of the earth or from the atmosphere. So, for instance, an earthquake is a hazard. An earthquake is not a disaster, because if an earthquake occurs in the middle of a desert and one camel broke its foot, we couldn't call that a disaster, could we? No. But if an earthquake occurs in a metropolis with 10 million people and we have billions of dollars in damage and loss of life, that's a disaster. So a disaster is really the social, economic, and environmental consequence from the impact of a hazard when our capacity to manage these events is overwhelmed. I think that's how I'd put it simply.
Okay.
So hazards do not have to translate into disasters if we have in place appropriate disaster risk management strategies.
Well put. Okay, I think I understand. So hazards can occur. It's really the end result or the effects of the people or who knows what city metropolis that would define it as a disaster. And if you can mitigate that ahead of time, then it wouldn't even have to be a disaster.
Well said.
All right. Well, that's what I do here. I summarize things and obviously bring on great guests. Okay, so let's move on. Why don't you tell me a little bit about your time as you started before you came to Canada and some of the things. I know you've been a consultant for a number of years. Why don't you kind of enlighten the audience of what you've been through and some of the things you've seen?
Okay. As I indicated initially, I've been in the field of disaster management for nearly 40 years. and I'm still learning. So I have worked as a consultant with United Nations agencies. I've worked with international development agencies such as the World Bank, the USAID, the Japan International Cooperation Agency in developing programs and policies for managing disaster risk in a variety of places. So I've worked with the UN Food and Agricultural Organization in the development of agricultural disaster risk management plan for specific countries in the Caribbean, as well as for the broader Caribbean. I've worked with the government of the British Virgin Islands in developing a microinsurance strategy for poor people who cannot afford traditional insurance, so as to help them to transfer that risk from the government coffers to the individual without, yes. I have worked with the Japan International Cooperation Agency in looking at the relationship between disasters and poverty. I have done analysis on the back end of hurricanes in the Caribbean region. I've worked with the USAID in development of a vulnerability assessment tool that countries can use to determine the extent of their vulnerability and in what specific areas of their capacity to manage and to respond that they're most vulnerable. So I am particularly interested in facilitating the safety of school children. So along with one of my PhD students, I've developed a set of games that can be utilized to enhance awareness about disasters and hazards in schools.
Wow. Yeah. Let me stop you there for a second. You said a bunch of little buzzwords there: insurance, food, children. Let's break down insurance for a second here, because I think most people, they see the devastation on TV. They assume that somebody's either going to have insurance or they're not going to have insurance. Can you kind of unpack that a little bit for us with the complexities, relationships? You mentioned government. Obviously, there's private insurance, property insurance.
What I will say is that the proportion of insured people in relation to the risk that they face is relatively small. It is small in developed countries and even smaller in developing countries. In one country that I worked, 90% of the population did not have any kind of risk insurance. And if we look at it by social structure, the poor invariably do not have insurance, not because they're averse to insurance, but because they can't afford it. Because if you think about it, the poorer people are going to live in structures that put them more at risk, generally.
Fair, yeah.
Which means that the premium that is associated with insuring them would be greater. So they will not have access. They couldn't afford traditional insurance. All is not lost, though, because there's something called microinsurance, which can be designed to facilitate access by the poor. The parameters involved in it are a bit different from your traditional insurance, but I'm not sure how much time we have to talk about that. If you need to know some more about it, I can say some more.
Now we can break that out in another podcast, surely. I think my comment on that, because I'm in property management, I mean, we deal in commercial and residential insurance, and I've seen claims with even hail damage or that big snowstorm we had, trees breaking and falling on power lines. And what you said there, Balfour, is I would say 100% correct, because if you are in an economic situation where you're able to afford a newer building, then the insurance is going to be proportionately less. So like you said, lower building value, it's going to be older, there's going to be more risk associated with it, there's going to be things, not to get too much into the insurance, and we're not even talking about the natural disasters and the risk of that region.
Yes.
And I'd like to actually transition that for a little bit here. We'll touch on it, because the reason, audience, that I wanted to bring Dr. Spence on, Balfour, onto the podcast is because his field of study is, disaster management, but also food security. And of course, I'm releasing this podcast in a hurry because of the recent back-to-back hurricanes that have been hitting the southern coast. We're talking about Helene and Milton. Can you, we're talking about Florida and some of the other underlying states there, but of course, that's where the mainstream media is focused, but the path is a lot larger than that. Can you kind of give your perspective on the path and the devastation that people are going to be going through and have gone through with the first hurricane?
And you're talking about Helene?
Yes.
Okay. With Helene, the path was somewhat similar in the sense that it traversed the Gulf of Mexico, which at this time of year, and especially this year, the surface water in the Gulf is very warm. And the truth is, don't want to sound like doom and gloom here, but the truth is, as the manifestations of changing climate becomes more pronounced, we should anticipate even warmer surface waters in places like the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, and the North Atlantic in general, which is, the hurricanes we experience, or they're called North Atlantic hurricanes, because they're similar phenomena elsewhere. They might not be called hurricanes, might be called typhoons or cyclones, but is essentially the same kind of events. Now, not to get too technical here, but hurricanes in general in the North Atlantic originate off the west coast of Africa in the North Atlantic.
Okay.
And they essentially follow a warm ocean current that flows across the Atlantic into the Gulf of Mexico, around the Florida Peninsula, and up the east coast of the US towards Atlantic Canada.
Okay.
That is a path that 90% of our hurricanes traverse. It's that warm ocean current that flows through there. This current will be warmer as climates get warmer. So we see two hurricanes in quick succession in Florida and the Florida Panhandle. This is basically following that warmer path, and the intensity of these hurricanes are a function of the temperature of the surface, the sea surface sea surface water, because that is what provides the energy that drives these storms.
Okay. So when you have, I mean, I remember taking my honeymoon, I think, well, it's just my anniversary last year, October 7th, sorry, last week. And I remember people saying, like, you're taking a cruise in October in the Gulf, you're asking for it down there. And yeah, I mean, we were very lucky not to have dealt with that. I can't even imagine if we had decided to go last week, and we're, so that's just the ships, never mind all of the other things. It's and global warming is what you're talking about here, right? It's affecting those. Yeah,
that's right. And because generally these events are fairly predictable. Hurricanes are what we call slow onset event, to distinguish them from earthquakes, which happen in a split second, right? We know a hurricane is on the way sometimes days before it impacts. And we also know what time of year. It's a pretty cyclical event. What time of year. So if you're anywhere in the Caribbean and the Gulf between the 1st of June and the 30th of November, you could be in trouble if you don't keep an eye on what the weather and climate conditions are in that area.
Okay, no, that's fair. So we spoke about insurance briefly. Food security. I hadn't even thought about that until I saw that as part of your job title. Can you discuss food security from a general sense, and then let's maybe circle around and speak about that in third world countries versus even first world?
Yeah, I'm going to the way I'm going to unpack this is to say that food security related issues, or rather food insecurity related issues, account for more death and health issues than any other type of hazards. Famine, starvation, malnutrition is one of the biggest killers on the planet as we speak. And you and I can sit here on TV and we can watch people literally dying of starvation in another country. That's the paradox of it. Now, when we talk about food security, we're talking really about the way in which people can, and I'm going to use the term legally, access food. So food aid is not food security. It's a stopgap mechanism to deal with food shortages. Now, there are two ways by which people can legally access food. One is by growing it themselves, or two, by purchasing it.
Okay.
To be able to grow food, you must have access to land. To purchase food, you must have access to an income.
Correct. Yes.
So if we look at it in that context, and we look at the millions and billions of people in the world who have neither access to land or income, then we see why these people are food insecure. They do not have legal access to food. They've lost it. In fact, one scholar describes it that access by income or purchase as entitlement. So essentially, they lose, as harsh as it sounds, they lose their entitlement to food. Now, let's relate that to disasters. Let's relate that to what has unfolded and is unfolding in Florida and other places. Scarcity of food. You cannot have access to food without production. So if production is impacted, it affects access.
Right.
Why? Because when production is reduced, the quantity and availability of food is reduced. The demand does not necessarily change, so the demand remains high. So a high demand chasing less of that good means higher prices.
Yeah, you've got supply and demand charts, right?
That's right. And of course, that means that those who are already poor will have reduced access to food.
Where they already had reduced access in the first place.
That's right, even more. So here, with what has happened in Florida, I could see our citrus prices, for instance, here in Canada, going up.
Mm-hmm.
And all that we rely on impacted areas for will change.
So the people, I mean, again, like with insurance, people who can't afford it, I mean, basically the disasters are just exacerbating every situation, right? They're just magnifying them 5, 10, 15x compared to what they would have been in the first place, which weren't great. But now you put the disaster in place. So how do you mitigate that? How do you prepare for that?
Well, you know, the good thing is that this is a matter. Well, we have to first of all recognize that no individual, community, or country or region can address this alone. Because the truth is that the drivers behind climate change, for instance, are not just Canadian drivers. They're not American drivers. They're global drivers.
Mm-hmm.
Greenhouse warming, it doesn't matter what the source of the greenhouse or where the source of the greenhouse gases are. It affects all of us on the planet. I'm therefore saying that the solution must lie in global collaboration and global partnership. And there are many such partnerships that have emerged over the last 2.5 decades.
So this is quite a hot button topic, right? Because I mean, you have environmentalists, you have people that just want to recycle. And I think the average person, maybe even admittedly myself included, knows that global warming's happening and you're like, okay, it's a little bit hotter. Yeah, there's going to be some famine. But you're suggesting, or are you suggesting, Balfour, that we as a society today can make that much of an impact on global warming such that there will be a measurable improvement in food security?
I am.
Wow.
I am making
Okay.
that claim that that we can significantly reduce our greenhouse emission while at the same time changing the way that we grow food.
Okay, can you explain that? Grow food, the way in which we grow food.
The way we grow food. We can apply science and technology to the way we grow food. We can, for instance, genetically engineer crops.
Of course.
More drought resistant. We can do much better at the way we use the land. For instance, there are certain types of crops which are excellent at fixing atmospheric nitrogen, the source of soil fertility, of fixing that nitrogen in the soil, legumes. If we practice the rotation of legumes with other crops, then it reduces our reliance on chemical fertilizers and the nitrous oxide that they will release into the atmosphere. Now, we don't necessarily need large tracts of land to produce food. You live in an apartment building, you could grow a lot of tomatoes on your balcony.
Okay, and that would make an impact?
Oh, absolutely. Because when the city of Brandon here, we have, I don't know if Winnipeg has one, there's a bin program where the city collects your organic waste, like your grass cutting, your tree cuttings, and so on. And the city takes it away and they compost it. And you can then collect the compost from the landfill free of cost to put on your garden, to grow your summer garden. There are summer gardens all around the city. When I was a graduate student at the University of Manitoba, one of the rail companies, I don't remember whether it's CN or CP, they would allocate strips of land along the rail tracks to international students to grow summer gardens. All of that is a contributor to food security because small plots like that do not use large amounts of chemical fertilizers.
Right.
So there's a lot that can be done and is being done. The Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations is one of the leaders in promoting this more kind of sustainable food production. So it has to be a multi-pronged approach, where we're dealing with slowing down global warming on the one hand and applying our technologies and innovations to more efficient food production systems on the other.
Okay, and if the food production system in a impoverished country is improved in the face of disaster, I mean, are you just suggesting that because they're growing more food, they just will have more? Or I mean, what if those crops are wiped out during a hurricane or things like that?
Right. So we have to analyze what the risks are. So if the risk is that their crops could be wiped out, what can we do to prevent their crops from being wiped out? So for instance, in one of the projects I worked with, the farmers would normally sow their seeds in the field that they will be transplanted. And what we did, we said, no, we provided them with little, those little things that we put our seedlings in and seed trays.
Yes.
And so when a hurricane approaches, they'll pick up their seed trays and they'll put it under the cellar, or they'll put it inside their house. 2 hours after the hurricane, the storm is over, they go back out and they plant. Normally, they would have lost all of that. So there are simple measures that can be applied. We have to, first of all, identify what the risks are and then work on the risk. You see, Garrett, for a long time, for most of the history of disaster management, the emphasis, the focus was on two things: relief and recovery. In other words, let it happen. Then we see if we can provide food and water to people and help them put their crops back. Now our emphasis is on the front end of that, mitigation. If we can mitigate the impact in the first place, then we save on the response and the recovery, because much less will be lost.
You know, I'm as I am continually blown away by my own podcast guests. I was one of those people. I thought, actually, admittedly, that I was going to have you on here. We're going to talk about aid. And when I thought about food security, I just thought about vandalism and people stealing the food from the aid trucks and things like that. But you're talking about a much more 10,000 foot, 100,000 foot view to be able to try all these little steps, you know, food insecurity, global warming. Yes. What you were talking about earlier about the crops and legumes is organic farming, I believe, right?
Yes.
Which,
yes.
Again, I go to the grocery store and I see organic and I see the price is 20, 30% more expensive. I don't think about the positive impact that organic farming can have on food insecurity. It's really opening my eyes.
On food insecurity, as well as on facilitating sustainability of our ecosystem services. Because if we're growing stuff organically, we're not polluting the groundwater.
Okay.
So it's going to cost us less to treat it, so that becomes potable.
Right, of course.
So we're making a lot of saving that way. Yeah.
Okay. No, I totally see that part. Let's take a very slight step into the hurricane disasters. And can you, I understand that we've spent, you know, a little bit of time talking about prevention and mitigation. Maybe walk the audience through what happens almost in real time on the ground in terms of a disaster happens and then the responses in your experience. What normally happens?
Okay. Well, what happens when we are under threat of impact from a hazard? What happens actually begins happening long before that threat occurs. Because every step that is taken during a threat, in order to be effective, has to be planned and tested to ensure that it will work. So what unfolds is a stepwise plan based on the testing that was carried out before. So we don't experience hurricanes in this part of the world, all right? Not on the prairies. We do in Atlantic Canada, but we experience a lot of floods. Now, by the time we get to December this year, Water Steward Manitoba will begin to assess how much snowfall did we get in Manitoba, or in the catchment of the Red River and the Assiniboine. They begin to analyze that. and they will analyze it all the way into the spring in order to make their flood forecast for the spring. Now, if a flood threatens, then the measures that we have planned begin to kick in. First of all, we have to, where do we need to pre-position equipment to respond? If we have an ambulance service on one side of the river, should we pre-position assets on the other side just in case we can't get across the river?
And what department, let's talk about the City of Winnipeg, Province of Manitoba, is responsible for even thinking about this?
Okay. EMO, which is the emergency management organization for Manitoba, is kind of the prime organization for the province. But each municipality has an emergency management portfolio within them. So the city of Brandon would have an emergency coordinator for the city. The rural municipalities will also have emergency coordinators, and they work together as a group. They train together, they work together. Some, of course, have more resource than others, but that basic structure is enshrined in the emergency management laws of Canada.
Management laws. Okay, so they're getting their structure and their direction from a tried and tested protocol that's probably coming more at a global level?
Not totally, because we understand the environment in which these hazards unfold will be different, but the basic framework exists. Now, each municipality, each province might need to tweak that to fit their situation.
What about aid? I mean, let's shift away from the floods here, because we know, I think, what can happen with aid with farmers and things like that. But in earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, tsunamis, where does the aid come from? Obviously, the hat gets passed around, but maybe enlighten us on that.
Yeah, well, the aid response is a planned response. We might not know how much aid is required, but the infrastructure for the distribution of aid is a part of the planning process. So the UN, the United Nations, for instance, has a very robust aid response program where if there's famine in Eritrea, there's a department that is ready to respond to that. Now, the UN in itself, the UN is really a conglomeration of different countries. So when we talk about the UN, it's spearheaded by this organization, but it's supported by the other countries around the globe. So it's not merely just passing around the hat. It's a structured response. Within that system, there are microsystems. So for instance, I have worked quite a bit in the Caribbean region. There's a regional disaster management organization called the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Organization. And it's an association of 23 countries in the Circum-Caribbean region that pool together and establish protocols among each other to respond to disasters, whether it's in the provision of food aid or human resource to recover from a hurricane. If one island gets hit, then there will be electricity personnel that will go there, and the infrastructure is in place to move them as quickly as possible.
So there is going to be, I'm guessing, a line item on a budget somewhere in each jurisdiction, each country, depending on the risk of these hazards and then subsequent disasters?
Yeah, each country in the region provides a subvention to the Caribbean State Emergency Management Agency. And so there's a collective pool of resources that is available for this response.
What about personnel? I mean, we see all of these hundreds of volunteers. Where do they come from?
Well, there are hundreds of volunteers, but a volunteer is not just someone who walks off the street and says, I want to help. Because to be effective in helping, one has to be trained to help. So volunteers of the volunteer organization are established. They're there because the volunteers have to go through training, and then when something happens, they're deployed. All right. Now, okay. So the Red Cross here, they're Red Cross volunteer, but these are trained personnel who undergo regular training. When something happens, the Red Cross says, all right, we need you in the shelters. And this is what you're trained to do. This is what I'm trained to do, etc. So it is very organized. I mean, there's some areas of volunteerism that doesn't require that kind of level of skill training. If we're going to fill sandbags, for instance, I can walk off the street and say, oh, I'd like to help. And, filling a sandbag is not very technical. Yeah.
No, but I mean, to your point, I think when I said volunteers, I did mean, even some of the expert medical personnel. I mean, my wife, nurse of 33 years, going to be retiring possibly next year. And it's always been on one of her lists to just be one of those people that can respond. How does someone even approach an organization to be trained, to be accepted as a volunteer?
Oh, so if let's say your wife wants to, the Red Cross, Red Crescent has a global reach. So any Red Cross office can be approached and said, I'm interested in being a volunteer. And they'll take it from there. They will take them through the process of what needs to be done, what's the protocol for doing it. Yeah.
Wow. No, it's really, really opened my eyes. When we talk about back-to-back disasters, and I mean, you said because of the climate, and I mean, we are in October as of the recording of this podcast, but is it very unusual to have back-to-back? I mean, this is literally not even a week later, and people probably haven't even taken off the storm shutters, and here we go again.
It is not unusual. And the thing is that as disaster risk managers, our approach to preparing for disasters is in what we call a multi-hazard context. Because a hurricane will generate fires. So fire is a separate hazard. So when we plan for hurricanes or we plan for earthquake, we're also planning for hazards at the same time, for fires at the same time, and we're planning for gas leaks at the same time. But having two big hurricanes back to back I have never seen that so close. And, I don't have, obviously, the research hasn't been done. But if I were to make an informed assumption, I would say the intensity of these two events, one after the other, is indicative of the level of warming that we are experiencing in the sea surface temperature. It's an enormous amount of energy that is being stored in that sea surface.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, to your point, just with the whole environment. So to paraphrase you then, Balfour, in terms of back-to-back disasters, basically those organizations are prepared for them, even though they're not prepared for them to be quite so close together. Is that what you're basically saying?
Well,
as much as
it
you
would be
can.
hard for me to say they're not prepared for them so close, because we knew that Milton was on its way for the past 5-6 days. We knew that. But the problem is that we had to be allocating resources to the cleanup of Helene. And
Right.
it doesn't matter who we are or where we are. Our resource capacity is quite finite. So
there's only so
at
many
some stage,
volunteers, right?
we can use volunteers, but volunteers will require certain resources to work with.
Right.
Yeah, we could co-op big companies and so on to bring to bear. Disaster risk management is always a continuing process. We're always learning, and there are a lot that we have learned from Helene and Milton, and I can assure you that these will be applied to the management of future events.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we're almost out of time here, but before we end, I just wanted to touch on awareness. I'm thinking I'm not aware of half the things you're talking about: food insecurity versus food security, and global warming, organic, farming and things like that, just nitrogen atmospheres. How much of a challenge is it to me, this is more of an awareness campaign that has to happen. How progressive are we being at the global level?
We're doing stuff, but it's not nearly enough. That's what I would say. In other words, we have focused a lot on campaigns. In the Caribbean region, everybody knows it's a hurricane season, so I need to stock up with food and fuel and so on. But that's not good enough. I really believe that what we need in place are awareness programs that begin with our children when they begin school, to let them aware of the hazard and the risks associated with these hazards, not just where they are, but globally. There has to be that awareness. The challenge is, how do you impart that kind of awareness to school children, to young children? I mean, you can't sit there and lecture at them. So what are you going to do?
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have to find innovative methods of imparting that knowledge, transferring that knowledge to students, because aware children will become aware adults. And I will briefly say that one of the ways I'm very convinced we could make that inroad with our awareness program is by developing disaster awareness games for children. We have done it in the Caribbean. I do we have an emergency operations lab here at the university, and students experiment with building these games and how they can make them exciting and relevant.
But even then, not to be a skeptic, but they still have to be accepted by the education and curriculum is the word I'm looking for, right? I mean, any resistance there, would you anticipate?
I really cannot speak for Canada, but when we tried this in the Caribbean region, there was a lot of resistance. It does not fit into the curriculum, but curricula are not cast in stone, I hope. So we have to make space for this critical and important aspect of our well-being in our school curriculum.
Yeah, I mean, we're not just talking about blue boxes and recycling water bottles, which is usually the extent of it. The bigger picture is never discussed.
No, here at the university, I had a talk with administration here, and I'm saying that when our students come in for orientation, awareness, hazard and disaster awareness should be an integral part of that orientation process. We must make our students in our universities and our schools be aware of what they can do and should do if there's an intruder, an active shooter.
Sure.
Because that will give us peace of mind as parents if we know that at least our children are not at the mercy of whatever unfolds.
Yeah, so we've got security, active shooters. I would also say that our education system, and again, this is a whole nother podcast, but money management that's never taught. And now the true impacts of environment, global warming, carbon footprints. I know me being in housing, we're trying to do an apartment block right now and reduce the carbon footprint.
Yes.
And for me, I'm just doing it because I know it's the right thing to do. Now I realize that there is a larger impact on things like the temperature in the Gulf.
Well, Gary, I'll just share with you that myself and a colleague, Dr. Shika Henry, we got a grant last year. We proposed a project where we wanted to assess how effective what we call nature-based solutions are in managing flood risks in the city of Brandon. The truth is that when I was a student in Winnipeg, Bishop Grandin ended at Pembina Highway.
Right.
Now there's a whole southwestern part of the city that has emerged. Our urban centers are growing at a phenomenal rate. And this growth is precipitating greater levels of runoff when rain falls.
Mm-hmm.
Because, concrete pavement, paved driveways,
sure. Mm-hmm.
and so on. Our stormwater drainage systems are not keeping abreast of the increased levels of runoff. And it's not keeping abreast, I imagine, because It is expensive. It's an expensive undertaking to upgrade storm drainage infrastructure in any city. So what we were looking at is how might we use natural solutions to reduce the amount of runoff following high intensity rainfall. And we explored a number of options. We did a lot of modeling with these to see how retention ponds would work, what would happen if we put in rain gardens on people's property, what incentives can we give you to have a rain garden instead of paving over your driveway or something like that. Have water run off into your garden, collected, and essentially percolates down to the groundwater system. And we did a presentation last night on the results of it to our sponsors in India. And we're having a workshop to disseminate this information to our stakeholders here in Brandon, including the city of Brandon, residential and commercial developers, NGOs, etc. So there's much that can be done.
Let me let you repeat that. A rain garden. What is exactly a rain garden other than what you had just said? Can you elaborate a little bit?
Okay, so a rain garden is, that, we pave our driveways.
Yeah.
And we have eaves around our house. So
Sure.
whatever water, it goes to the ground and it runs off into our storm drainage system.
Right.
What a rain garden does, it channels that water into excavated area. It's not always very noticeable, but there's a slight dip, let's say on your lawn, and it's ballasted with stones at the bottom that allows water to percolate. Whatever is, instead of running off into the storm drainage, it runs off in there and it gradually soaks back into the groundwater system. So it eases the pressure on the storm drainage and it doesn't flood your property.
Mm-hmm.
So, but you have to, first of all, promote the awareness of these measures. And one of the ways to get people to do it is to provide incentive. If you say, well, we'll knock 10% off your property tax if you have a rain garden.
Right.
It's not a loss.
But what is that 10% versus insurance, basements flooding, overland flooding? I mean, or the cost of having to expand the drainage infrastructure.
It's actually an investment.
Yes.
It is an investment. Yes.
Yeah.
So wow. There are several others. I did some of my emergency management training in Japan. And I remember going to Okinawa, the city of Okinawa, 3 days after a major typhoon had passed through. And there was very little evidence that a major typhoon had passed through. Why? Because the building codes required that all buildings are shuttered. They have hurricane shutters. It's a requirement that roofs do not have overhang that can be lifted off.
Mm.
The trees along the boulevard are not allowed to grow more than about 7 feet high. So they don't fall across the roadway and block it, and they don't bring down power lines.
Mm-hmm.
Power lines, well, they can't bring down power lines because the power lines are all below ground.
Right.
We have to begin to think outside the box. And there are examples all around the world that we could follow.
and I'm really interested to hear what you have to say. This is the Investing to Win podcast. How do you define success, and what does winning look like for you?
Okay, that's an interesting question. All right. I believe that to be a winner, to win, you have to first believe in yourself. Secondly, you have to believe that your attainment can reach the stars and beyond. As we say in Latin, ad aspera per aspera, to the stars and beyond. Third, to win, we have to set ourselves realistic goals. But goal setting is not going to be sufficient. We then have to design realistic pathways to achieve those goals. But at the same time, in that design, we need to be agile. We need to be flexible so that we can accommodate new opportunities that emerge. And I think finally, we have to be introspective, retrospective, and self-evaluate.
Very, very profound words.
Thank you, Garrett.
That was amazing. Dr. Spence is a world of knowledge. I don't normally jump in and do a recap, but we had some issues with my mic towards the end, and I had to edit out my wrap-up comments. So that's why I'm capping off the episode with a few words. I'd just like to thank Dr. Spence for agreeing to do this last-minute interview and taking time out of his busy university schedule. There's lots of takeaways here, and I'm sure there'll be some pretty strong opinions, but what do you think? Is global warming contributing to the increased frequency and intensity of these hurricanes? And do you think responsible farming and some of the other initiatives he mentioned will make a difference? Leave a comment and let's discuss.